Hello everybody, I'm Rishad Salamat. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, oil prices are on edge. American consumers are already feeling it at the pump. Donald Trump says it's a small price to pay for defeating Iran, but is it really, or could rising energy costs fuel inflation in the US? Europe is at risk too, and inflation there could be sharper. Gas prices across the continent have soared. A prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could hit households and businesses hard. Asian manufacturing countries are bracing for an energy shock. The region depends heavily on energy imports from the Gulf. What could that mean for their economies, and how will central banks there and elsewhere respond? It's caused the largest energy supply shock in decades. The conflict between the US, Israel and Iran is rattling oil markets. Crude prices have been swinging wildly, spiking to levels not seen since 2022 before pulling back as markets react to every twist in the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, while attacks on energy facilities in the Middle East threaten to deepen the crisis even further. From American drivers at the pump to European factories and Asian economies, the impact is already being felt. President Donald Trump, though, says the rise in oil costs is, quote, a very small price to pay for safety and peace. But investors warn that if the conflict drags on, there's a serious danger of what's called stagflation. That means high inflation and slow growth, which could happen on a global scale. Fintan Monaghan reports.
The Strait of Hormuz is normally one of the world's busiest sea lanes. 20% of the world's oil and natural gas passes through here. But due to the conflict between the US, Israel and Iran, shipping has ground to a halt. And the economic shockwaves are being felt around the world. In the United States, petrol prices are already on the rise. 9 days into the conflict, they'd spiked 14%, clocking at around $3.40 a gallon. Average people are feeling the pinch, and this could have knock-on effects for the rest of the economy.
I'm paying more on gas money, so definitely I'm going to be making less money than what I'm making. I won't be able to rush those deliveries as fast as I used to because of the gas prices.
This is also happening in what could be a pivotal economic and political moment. A worse-than-expected jobs report showed the US economy lost around 92,000 jobs in Q4 last year. The Fed was considering more rate cuts, but these might be pushed back due to growing uncertainty over inflation. And with midterm elections on the horizon, the fate of Congress may be decided by the health of the economy. US President Donald Trump is reassuring the public that the war is worth it, and that the spike in oil prices will only be temporary. Meanwhile, the European Union has long imported virtually all its fossil fuels, making it vulnerable to sudden shifts in global prices. Europe already suffered an energy crisis in 2022, when Russia's war in Ukraine disrupted supply. Now they're seeing prices rise once again, which could mean more pain for consumers. And while the continent has reduced its dependence on Russian energy, some countries in Eastern Europe still rely on Russian imports. At this vulnerable moment, Russian President Vladimir Putin is threatening to turn off the supply.
Perhaps it would be more advantageous for us to stop supplying the European market right now, move to the emerging markets and consolidate our position there. And here too, there is, I want to be clear, no political motive.
But it's in Asia that the greatest impact might be felt. It takes in around 86% of crude oil and liquefied natural gas that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. With that now cut off, reserve supplies are under pressure. China has already ordered its refineries to stop exports of diesel and petrol. The country has stockpiles, but is taking no chances. South Korea has capped domestic fuel prices for the first time in nearly 30 years to control soaring energy costs, a move to ease pressure on consumers. And India has secured a 30-day waiver from the US, allowing it to import sanctioned Russian oil. This will allow it to build up reserves to weather the crisis. Washington is considering extending this offer to other allies. The impact of the war will go far beyond the Gulf region. And analysts say the longer the conflict drags on, the deeper the consequences are likely to be for the global economy. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
So how can this crisis lead to more inflation? Oil is used to produce petrol, so that's one of the first things to go up in price. Then the indirect effects. A spike in the price of fossil fuels will force businesses to pay more for energy and for transport, and That drives up the prices of everything else. Those costs are passed on to the consumer as a result. 1/3 of the world's fertilizer supply also passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Prices are already climbing, and that will have a knock-on effect on the cost of food. The aviation industry is also being hit hard. The crisis has caused major disruptions as flights are routed away from the Gulf. This, along with a rise in the cost of jet fuel, is pushing up ticket prices. And if the war ends now, analysts warn that fuel prices won't return to January lows quickly. Gulf states have cut production as storage fills up with fuel that they simply can't export. They're warning that it'll take time to bring output back to previous levels, and the risk of a renewed conflict would also increase the cost of transport as shipping firms charge a premium for taking the risk. To discuss this more, joining me from London is Freya Beamish. She's the chief economist at Global Data TS Lombard. From Brussels, we have Rebecca Christie. She's a senior fellow at Bruegel. And joining us also from Hong Kong is Alicia Garcia-Herrero. She's the chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis. Well, first of all, Alicia, let's start off with you. And how big a threat does this conflict really pose for the global economy?
Well, it's a huge threat, and I'm going to focus on Asia just to give a few numbers. Starting with China, we're talking about 40% of its imports of oil coming from the Gulf, including Iraq. And Iraq is a proxy, partial proxy of Iran oil, as well as Malaysia also Iran oil. But, if we focus on the Gulf, there's no way that whether you use strategic reserves, Japan has, in principle, even more than China, none of that can make it. Even Russian access to Russian oil won't be enough because even Russia is limited in its production. So it is a huge shock if it lasts long, and that's the key question. Will Trump allow the global economy to sink right before, very important elections for him? So if it lasts, it'll be disastrous, stagflation for sure, but it may not last.
Rebecca, same question to you.
In Europe, certainly energy prices are the big question mark, and they are a question mark to the extreme. We've seen giant swings just in the last 24 hours before this recording based on guesses from things Donald Trump has posted on social media about how long this conflict will last. If it's a short-term pressure on oil and gas and fossil fuel moving around the world, it won't be great, but it will be manageable. If it lasts for a long time, indeed, the effect on inflation, the effect on economic growth, the effect on trade could be very, very big.
Freya, it's the length, the duration of this conflict, and also to get things back on track again, which is going to be the real fulcrum here, I suppose.
Yeah, the duration, our base case, and it has to be a base case because, of course, we don't have a crystal ball. Our base case is that Trump doesn't want this war. He may have started it, but he doesn't want to continue it, it seems. And the kind of the key political parameter there is the affordability crisis in the US in a midterms year. That said, there has been already a spike in oil prices, and we don't know how quickly it will sort of revert back down. We do think it will revert below 80 in due course, but the ball is to some degree in Iran's court at this stage. We do think that the Iranian regime wants to survive, and a necessary condition of survival will flow and they get those revenues. So that's the sort of the parameters and the reasons why we believe that it is a time-limited thing. If we're wrong about that, then this is very serious with regards to inflation. I would say actually the clear analog is to 2022, and in terms of the impact on growth versus inflation, this time around we may find that the inflationary impact is less the main concern, and that it's actually growth that takes the hit this time around. This has been a very resilient US economy, but the buffers between US recession and between the US economy and recession have now worn much thinner, and so any kind of shock at this stage can push us towards that recession. That's in the worst case scenario. But even if we move back from that worst case scenario, which, as I said, is our base case, that we do move back from the worst case, We are still in a situation where this is doing damage to the way that investors think about markets and think about risks, and the same for people in the economy. So even short of that worst case scenario, we could see investors gradually starting to price risk differently, term premium rising. There have been a lot of these shocks, negative supply shocks hitting the economy, and that does start to change investor behavior to the detriment of equity valuations and pushing term premium higher.
Rebecca, especially for Europe, I mean, is the gas equation more important than the oil one, given oil inventories in Europe are very low right now?
Well, fortunately, Europe is heading into the summer months where heating and winter protection will be less of an issue. So it really depends on how long it lasts. The EU is in the middle of a big debate over how quickly to switch to renewables and how to bolster its electric grid so that energy generated by renewables can be distributed evenly, so you don't have some places with too much electricity and some places with not enough. All of that will play into it, as well as these blockades coming from the Gulf.
And Alicia, with Asia in mind, is it an oil versus gas equation as well, or is the oil side of things the more likely to be inflationary?
I think oil is more important. Gas, well, to start, there's a lot of gas pipelines around that do not depend so much on the Strait of Hormuz. The exception, though, would be Taiwan. Is very dependent on LNG from Qatar. So that would be really a red line. It's only around 15 days of strategic reserves, which is minimal. I think South Korea, Japan, I mean, they can cope better because of Russia, but and obviously China. But still, it's a big shock for everybody. Southeast Asia, terrible. Thailand, terrible. There we do have a big problem, except Malaysia.
Yeah, and Alicia, back to you on this, but could the policy response actually make things worse? Because let's not forget, this is cost-push inflation. It almost acts like an interest rate hike. And if policymakers start to raise the cost of borrowing interest rates, that could make it a double whammy.
Yeah, we have two worrisome cases to start watching. One is Australia. There was no mention of Iran, but we had a speech, I think the vice governor talking about not enough spare capacity generally. But it sounds like, wow, this is not good news. And RBA hiked recently and unexpectedly in a way. So, we could see more there. And the most obvious and worrisome case is Japan. Because Japan, in a way, we all thought they would hike maybe, July, maybe June. But now, because of the yen and, all of this huge dependence on oil, the odds are that they may hike sooner. That might hit the Japanese economy because it might be very unexpected compared to what the kind of speed that people had in mind. And if we were to see more stimulus, South Korea has already announced that they will cap electricity prices, oil prices. If we see that in Japan, with the big fiscal deficit that we already have at hand, with Takaichi having increased it already, especially for defense and protection for households, that's going to hit, and we could see, spiral in JGB yields, in the cost of funding for the government in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. And Freya, is monetary policy really a redundant tool in all this?
It used to be the case that it was almost like a sort of interview question. How does a central bank respond to a cost-push inflation shock? Well, you sort of don't, because it's supposed to sort itself out. But having been through the experience of 2022, the risk here is that central bankers play the same playbook as they were forced into playing in 2022, when actually the underlying macroeconomic conditions are quite different now. So the big sort of salient point with regards to the backdrop in 2022 was you had this huge fiscal impulse coming into the economy from the US. Similarly, monetary policy was very accommodative. You do actually have a positive fiscal impulse coming into the US this time around, and the same in Germany, but it's dwarfed compared to the size of that was supporting growth, demand, and inflation in 2022. So this time around, as I sort of alluded to, I think it's actually the risks are more tilted towards this damaging growth. In the sense that you get that cost push inflation coming into the economy, that then sort of destroys demand. But if you get central banks sort of compounding that, as markets currently expect, by hiking, then that could really sort of precipitate a move towards recession.
And the same question for you here as well, Rebecca, and also in the sense of how did this affect Donald Trump's affordability agenda just 8 months before those midterms?
It's quite ironic that he has, out of his own discretion, started a war that will make affordability worse, not better, in the United States. There are so many mixed messages coming from this administration toward the economy in terms of, do they want people to have more jobs and more access to stuff, and housing in particular is a real concern? Or are we going to spend money on these things like advertising campaigns and government building construction? And now this war, of course, is the biggest one. One of the things that comes up over and over again is the very high cost of the US military arsenal. So every time the US loses even one object, air defense or a plane or something like that, that represents an awful lot of money that could have been used on some of these other issues that have a bigger impact on people's day-to-day lives in the United States.
Alicia, looking at China, and they came out with their growth target the other day, which was right down there compared to previous years. Do you think they need to revise that, given what's going on?
They may have revised, and that's why you saw the 4.5 to 5. They may have changed that last minute, although we always think China doesn't change anything last minute, but it could happen. And I tell you why, because the 5% was quite comfortable after the Supreme Court decision to eliminate the emergency tariffs, because it was very much China-centric, also Brazil, but China was the second best treated out of that. They saw massive reduction in tariffs. And in fact, today we had export data for the first 2 months of the year, and that was amazing, 22% increase. I mean, unheard of, except, maybe after COVID or something, like extreme cases. So I think China felt probably comfortable with 5, but then it saw what was coming right before, in the midst of the starting presentation of the work report in the 2 sessions in the Langhui, and probably they said, let's give us some space. I'm not sure whether that space is enough, 4.5, because if things linger, it might still be too high for China. We'll see. That depends, I quite agree, on what happens with external demand. With demand more than inflation. Inflation is not the issue for China, as we all realize. If anything, is helping China reflate out of very low deflation. But the impact on external growth out of this crisis is very concerning for China.
Freya, when you look at this and you look at what Europe did post 2022, they have trying to get a new gas model together. Do they have to come up with another set of arrangements for their security, energy security, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, there has certainly been some progress made since 2022, but it's incomplete. And when we sort of ran the charts, looking at the stockpiles, it's interesting that there wasn't more of an effort to sort of build that up. As has been said already, we are going into the summer period, so that allows some kind of leeway there. And our base case is that this does sort of start to settle down before the winter months sort of kick in. But certainly there's still a long way to go to improve that infrastructure within Europe. And again, sort of coming back to your question with regards to interest rates, it is the ECB that's most likely to sort of step towards that hike We anyway were sort of looking at the ECB as moving more towards a hawkish stance, and this could actually sort of push them kind of further in that direction if oil prices and gas prices remain elevated.
Well, do you think, actually, Freya, do you think things can get worse because the commodities are priced in dollars? You've got also weakening European currencies. Is that a double whammy?
Yeah, so last year there was a little bit of a short period of time where it looked like the rest of the world was going to escape the flip side of the exorbitant privilege, which is what you've essentially just described. The US is protected to some degree by these shocks, by the pricing of commodities in dollars. And last year, because there was so much else going on with regards to a kind of a structural shift in the dollar, we had this period where you were getting some tensions arising in the Middle East, and yet the euro was still performing quite well. Now, this is obviously a much bigger situation in the Middle East, and the dollar has already sort of made a lot of that kind of first step of the structural shift. And so this time around, it's a more normal response from foreign exchange markets, with the dollar appreciating and net importers of energy depreciating, and that does sort of cause an amplifier on the energy shock.
Rebecca, what would you say is being priced in right now in the various markets?
In the long term, the markets seem to be expecting that things will go back to more or less normal. I say more or less because with the tariffs, with the uncertain growth outlook, with the elections coming up, there's not a whole lot of certainty. In the short run, we can continue to see very big swings depending on what happens, because people are edgy and they're nervous. And inflation could go way up and growth could go down. And if that's the case, everyone is really stuck with how to react. There's not a clear move for central bankers or for market participants.
Alicia, the same question, but I'm reframing it slightly. Were, let's say, crude markets underpricing the risk here as we went into this conflict? And are they still underpricing it?
Well, I think oil prices are high enough not to be underpricing anything that lasts long, if you see what I mean. If these prices are to last for even 6 months, I mean, we'll be killing the global economy. And therefore, I think they're not underpricing. If anything, hopefully they're overpricing. But again, this is all about how long this lasts. So no underpricing in my view.
Freya, I want to go back to what you said about the ECB turning hawkish. Now, tell me something. Do you think they're going to be changing course on that? And could it actually be a huge detriment for the euro if they did start to raise rates? Having said that, it might mitigate some of the other concerns.
Yeah, so this comes back to the idea that there's no clear response for this type of a shock, and that is why it's so difficult for investors and for central bankers. From the investor standpoint, you have a situation where inflation is rising, and that's destroying growth. So it's bad for equities and bad for bonds at the same time. Historically, if you have a big enough shock of this type, a negative supply shock, that does also tend to push up term premium, because investors are asking for more compensation for the bond, because it's just deteriorated in its quality as a hedge. Now that we've had a lot of these types of shocks, we are starting to see this uptrend in term premium, higher highs and higher lows, and that probably continues regardless of the result of this type of shock, of this specific shock, because these types of shocks keep hitting the economy. Then when you sort of turn to the central banking response, as we said, it puts the two aspects of a mandate at risk. And even if there isn't a dual mandate for the specific central bank, it's obviously a sort of a concern as to, if you start to get that inflation, is that going to then just destroy the demand growth, and therefore you don't need to hike? I suspect that the sort of the balance on the ECB is that if we do see inflation picking up on the back of this shock, then they will kind of accelerate their move towards hawkishness, just because of the makeup of the ECB. Personally, I think that would be a mistake.
Rebecca, you were nodding there, but I also want to get you to give you the Fed's take in your view.
The Fed is at a real crossroads, because we're about to see a big change in personnel. If Kevin Warsh replaces Jerome Powell as is the current direction of travel. I say all of these things in cautious words because the US is so uncertain right now, and that itself holds back growth. So it's very difficult for the Fed to figure out how to navigate the political waters, the market expectations, its dual mandate of full employment and contained inflation. We saw that the jobs numbers are not looking great out of the US. It's not clear how permanent a trend this is. None of this is clear. So it's a difficult place to make any sudden moves. And the US has the extra constraint of the White House putting a lot of pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates regardless of fundamental conditions. So it's a tough spot.
Alicia, with that in mind, Japan's got to be one of the most affected in Asia. They import nearly all their energy and also fertilizer. We've not really discussed that very much.
Yeah, well, fertilizers are, of course, another of the channel. I mean, there's many others because the Strait of Hormuz is not only about oil, it's also about refined oil coming from the Gulf and thereby products related to that and fertilizers or plastic or petrochemical, so there's a lot of things that will create this this additional inflation beyond oil. And I think the more you move into frontier markets, the worse it will be, for a very simple reason. And it's not only refineries in the Gulf that may have a hard time. In fact, if these refineries get less than 60% of the actual oil to refine, they have to stop. So the shock can actually be amplified because of the refinery activity in the Gulf. But beyond the Gulf, China is a major refinery option for many Southeast Asian economies. So is Singapore. And already China has announced that it will basically stop exports of refined products. So, if you are at the bottom of the chain, and the more so if you are of course, a frontier market, but until recently, even Vietnam, I mean, they've managed to build a big refinery only recently, so I'm sure that that's not enough to cover all of the needs. So if you don't have refineries and you depend on others and they shut their doors to exports, you're double in danger. And that's why I think it gets worse and worse given your level of income. It's not only about exporting oil, it's about having refined oil.
Freya, just very briefly, is the renewable side of the thing the only big winner here?
Well, we don't know the outcome of how long this is going to last. And to a certain degree, there's been this big shift in the US away from renewables, at least at the policy level. And that was on the supply side. And now we have a US policy move that is kind of increasing the gap between demand and supply. So in a sense, there's you could read this as a kind of a shift back towards fossil fuels, depending on sort of how long it lasts, and that's certainly one interpretation of this. The broader sort of shift towards renewables in Europe is, of course, accelerated by this by another instance of a major sort of risk and threat to fossil fuel supply.
Freya Beamish, Rebecca Christian, Alicia Garcia Herrero, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X. I'm at Richard TV, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Rishad Salamat from the whole team in Doha. Thanks for joining us. The news is next, right here on Al Jazeera.